In this video, we'll continue our investigation of former Native American sites in the Chicago region. This time, we'll be investigating the Kennicott Mounds, positioned on a small knoll overlooking a sharp meander of the Des Plaines River, situated between River Grove and Elmwood Park, Illinois, where once a series of earthworks were built by indigenous people, perhaps more than a millennia in the past, to honor their dead. Here too may once have been a habitation site, taking advantage of the river, the adjacent forest and prairie, and a possible abundant seasonal food source. Please join us as we examine the Kennicott Mounds.
Primary sources for this video include contemporary newspaper accounts of the discovery and excavation of the Kennicott Mounds in 1869. Subsequent newspaper accounts and field notes from amateur archaeologists that visited the site in the 1900 timeframe, such as Albert Scharf, Carl Dilg, and Ernest Smith. Illinois State Archaeological Survey notes, period maps and aerial images, U.S. Census information, and vital records.
The Kennicott Mound site is situated on private property, about 900 feet north of North Avenue, 400 feet south of Bloomingdale Avenue, and just to the east of Thatcher Avenue, in Elmwood Park, Cook County, Illinois, in an area approximately 250 feet north to south by 150 feet east to west. The mound site is positioned along a ridge or knoll, standing above a fairly steep embankment, a few tens of feet high, overlooking the Des Plaines River from the east, with the distance of the mound site to the river being on the order of 150 feet. This same ridge, where Thatcher Avenue now traverses, is believed to have been the site of an ancient Native American trail that once carried indigenous travelers north and south along the river valley.
The site is flanked to the west by the Evansfield and Sunset Bridge Meadow Cook County Forest Preserves, which includes the Des Plaines River Basin and adjoining natural areas. In fact, the Kennicott Mounds as an archaeological site also likely extends a few hundred feet to the north and west, incorporating a possible habitation site based upon ad hoc finds of pottery sherds and stone-chipped tools. The Kennicott Mound site is known to archaeologists as 11CK671, the 11 referring to Illinois, as part of the Smithsonian's National Database, the CK referring to Cook County, and the 671 denoting the sequential number assigned to the site upon official registration in the early 1990s by local naturalist and historian Edward Lacey.
The naming of the Kennicott Mounds is often misattributed. The Kennicott Mounds were not named for the illustrious and semi-legendary naturalist Robert Kennicott, the founder and first director of the Chicago Academy of Sciences, as is sometimes reported. Nor were they named for Ransom E. Kennicott, the first forester of the Cook County Forest Preserves and nephew of Robert Kennicott, as is also sometimes conveyed. The mounds instead drew their name from another of the Kennicott clan, one less mentioned, Charles Kennicott, Robert's eldest brother. Charles Kennicott was the eldest son of John Albert Kennicott and Mary Schutz Ransom, and was a horticulturalist and nurseryman by training and by trade.
In the autumn of 1869, William Stimson, the director of the Chicago Academy of Sciences, was traveling along the eastern banks of the Des Plaines River on a local expedition into the Chicago countryside. At that time, the Des Plaines River Valley was rural, sparsely populated, and still somewhat untamed. Stimson was then 37 years of age, originally from Massachusetts, and a nationally recognized naturalist who specialized in marine fauna. He had spent previous decades in field research along the eastern Atlantic seaboard, and then at various locations adjoining the Pacific Ocean, in far-flung places such as Australia, Japan, China, and the Pacific Northwest, followed by years of research at the newly created Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. It was here that Stimson befriended Robert Kennicott, a self-trained naturalist from the wilds of the U.S. interior.
Both Kennicott and Stimson were members of the informal Megatherium Club, a small lodge consisting of young, affluent, educated white men who were working hard to make names for themselves among the U.S. scientific elite, while at the same time using their off hours for carousing and general mayhem. William Stimson was the club's ringleader. As young Robert Kennicott's star rose, he, along with Northwestern University, co-founded the Chicago Academy of Sciences in 1857. In the years that followed, Kennicott convinced the organization's board of trustees to bring in William Stimson as acting director while he was away on an extended research mission to the Pacific Northwest and Alaska in the mid-1860s, a trip from which Kennicott never returned, although that's a story for another time. Stimson formally took over as director of the Chicago Academy of Sciences with the death of Robert Kennicott in 1866.
Along with Stimson on his 1869 Des Plaines River expedition were at least two other members of the Chicago Academy of Sciences, Benjamin Durham, a 33-year-old Chicago physician, and 38-year-old Charles Kennicott, a horticulturalist from south central Illinois, the older brother of his departed friend and colleague. What the purpose of this country excursion was is not entirely clear. Charles Kennicott may have been along for his plant and fauna expertise, but it is more likely that he was there as he had recently excavated several indigenous skeletons from a hillside along the east banks of the Des Plaines River at Haas Park, which later became Forest Home Cemetery. We've told that story before in a previous video. The presence of Durham, a medical doctor with knowledge of human anatomy, also suggests that Stimson was looking for additional burial mounds, akin to what Charles Kennicott had earlier discovered.
Stimson and his colleagues likely started their small adventure from the railroad station at Harlem, now Forest Park, served by the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, where they likely inspected Charles Kennicott's recent excavations at the Indian Hill Formation near Haas Park before heading north, possibly in a rented horse-drawn wagon. The small group would have rode past the gentleman's farm of David Cunningham Thatcher, who had only recently passed away early in 1869, and who eventually lent his name to Thatcher Woods. As they passed from Proviso Township into Layden Township, along a ridge overlooking the Des Plaines River from the east, Stimson took note of earthworks a short distance from the trail that took them northward. Newspapers reported that the land belonged to a Mr. True, who most likely was John Drews, an emigrant farmer from Prussia, from whom Stimson received permission to excavate. Stimson recognized that the features were most likely made by humans, and surmised that they were attributable to the hypothesized mound builder culture of the past.
The newspaper accounts that described the discovery and subsequent excavations of these earthworks appeared in Chicago and regional newspapers from November 8th through early December 1869, describing events from the previous weeks and varying in their details. And they seem to have been based on differing narratives and sources. The initial reports were that Stimson had excavated several mounds near Haas Park, close by the Des Plaines River, removing the remains of more than 20 human beings, which Stimson thought to be fairly old, based upon the counting of tree rings from trees taken down during the excavation. The rural area still had a fair number of trees and scrub scattered across the landscape, and the newly discovered mounds had several mature trees growing from them.
Subsequent reports provided more details as to the dimension and layout of the earthworks, as well as the artifacts removed from at least a few of the excavated mounds, but with no comprehensive description and with maddeningly varying details. Nonetheless, we'll attempt to reconstruct their observations, based primarily on the account of Dr. Benjamin Durham, given in newspapers of November 9, 1869.
There were at least 5 mounds described. in varying shapes and sizes, all being between 2 and 3.5 feet in height above the surrounding terrain. The first mound described was elliptical in shape, parallel to the main direction of the river, with a long axis of 48 feet, a short axis of 28 feet, and a 6-foot trench or depression surrounding the mound. The second mound of the group was 52 feet south of the first and 60 feet from the riverbank, also elliptical in shape, with a major axis 37 feet long and a minor axis 29 feet in length, also with a 6-foot wide trench surrounding the ellipse.
The third mound was 70 feet southeast of the first, and believed to be in the shape of an animal, perhaps a bear, also parallel with the river, the body being elliptical with a major axis 60 feet long and a minor axis 30 feet in length. The front extremities were 21 feet long, while the back extremities were stated as being longer, perhaps 25 feet or so. There is no mention of a trench associated with this mound.
A fourth mound was placed due east of the bear-shaped mound and was described as being well marked and 102 feet in circumference, with no mention of its shape or a trench. We can only assume that it was roughly circular, with a diameter of approximately 30 feet, give or take. A fifth mound is described as being a circular mound, 60 feet in circumference, and so about 20 feet in diameter, with an old stump on its summit. Here, too, there is no mention of a trench. But unfortunately, no meaningful details are given as to the location of this mound, relative to the others or to the surrounding terrain, only that it was hidden in the underbrush. As this was not among the first mounds to be found, it is likely that it was at least beyond the first two mounds found in terms of distance to the river, and may have been to the north, south, or even east of the mound group.
The excavations of these mounds lasted several days, according to accounts, likely in October of 1869, when brush had started to die back and temperatures were more conducive to the exhausting effort of digging. Stimson apparently requested Charles Kennicott to excavate the mounds and was assisted by Dr. Benjamin Durham. The sketchy newspaper reports indicate that at least a few of the mounds were put to the spade. Mound 2, to the south, was dug to a depth of 36 inches, where a small bone was found, but nothing else. They dug an additional 6 inches into the earth, hitting a harder clay, which did not appear to be disturbed, but found nothing more. The fifth mound described was also excavated. Digging down 3 feet into the mound's surface, they came upon portions of 2 skulls and an impression of a third. One of the skulls appeared to have a puncture in its surface, which they interpreted to be a battle wound.
The Chicago Academy excavation continued on and found additional human remains, although few details were given as to the location of these finds. Charles Kennicott was noted as having found 2 skeletons in a sitting posture, which we might interpret today as being a flex burial, as well as 3 others in close proximity to these 2. At least 2 nearly complete skeletons were found, although the general condition of the bones was stated to be poor, as they were exceedingly fragile and would easily fall apart when removed. These remains were said to be found about 3 feet below the surface of the mound, meaning at ground level or just below. The accounts further state that few or no artifacts were found along with the human remains, although their methods of excavation would be nowhere near as thorough as today's standards.
Contemporary newspaper accounts summarize that the 1869 Chicago Academy excavation found the remains of 22 individuals. But it's entirely possible that these accounts were conflating the 17 human remains found earlier in 1869 by Charles Kennicott at Haas Park, with the 5 additional skeletons found by Kennicott at the farm of John Drews, which would neatly add up to 22 sets of remains. As these 2 distinct Des Plaines River mound groups, although 3 miles apart, were often discussed in the same breath, especially as one person, Charles Kennicott, had played a significant role in the excavation of both sites. A few years later, John Wells Foster, who closely examined the remains found from this excavation, wrote that there were portions of 11 human skeletons removed from these mounds. Given that his was a first-hand account, after careful examination of the mound's artifacts, we believe this to be the more accurate count for this mound group.
It is unclear as to how Stimson, Kennicott, and Durham interpreted their finds. Little is said in this regard, except that they dated the mound site to be at least 100 years of age or older, owing to their clever use of dendrochronology, counting the tree rings of one of the trees removed from the mounds. However, other members of the Chicago Academy were more than eager to interpret their results, as well as the earlier excavation made by Charles Kennicott at the Indian Hill feature of Haas Park. They saw it in light of the Mound Builders epic. The Mound Builders hypothesis was a theory then circulating in the realms of North American antiquity, proposing that the many complex earthworks found throughout the United States, such as the Serpent Mound in Ohio, the Effigy Mounds of Wisconsin, the Great Platform Mounds of Cahokia, were all attributable to a lost advanced civilization that once occupied much of the interior of the United States in prehistory, but were wiped out by a later inferior race, the Native Americans encountered by the Europeans in the 17th to 19th centuries. It was an idea that had gained traction within the scientific community as well as more popular literature of the time, largely because it absolved the newly ensconced U.S. settlers of wiping out Native Americans, who they believed to be a lesser and cruder race.
One proponent of this idea was John Wells Foster, a lawyer, cum geologist, cum anthropologist, who was to become president of the Chicago Academy of Sciences in 1870. He literally wrote the book on this flawed and bigoted premise, Prehistoric Races of the United States of America, published in 1874, shortly after his death. To his credit, he uses detailed measurements of human remains as data for his forensic analysis. But to his discredit, he uses these measurements to make broad, sweeping statements with oftentimes erroneous conclusions, and with an underlying bias against Native Americans and indigenous people in general. Notably for our story, Foster referred to the mounds on Drew's property in Layden Township, Cook County, as Stimson's Mounds, naming them for their discoverer, William Stimson, while referring to the Haas Park Mounds, excavated by Charles Kennicott, as the Kennicott Mounds.
In the decades that followed, subsequent references to the excavated skulls found at Drew's farm in Layden Township, Cook County, Illinois, appear to have conflated and closely associated them with those found by Charles Kennicott 3 miles to the south at Haas Park. The repeated association between the two mound groups ultimately resulted in the Drew's farm site, the Stimson Mounds, being referred to as the Kennicott Mounds. This is not altogether unfitting, as Charles Kennicott played a major role in their excavation.
The human remains and other artifacts removed from these mounds in the autumn of 1869 were stored and curated at the Chicago Academy of Sciences, at the organization's admirable new building on Wabash Avenue in Chicago, between Jackson and Van Buren. This newly built structure was completed in 1868 and included state-of-the-art research facilities, the first public natural history museum in Chicago, as well as the United States, all housed within a stone, brick, and steel building, designed to be fireproof and built for the ages.
But alas, this did not prove, as it seemed the young academy was born under a dark star. In early October of 1871, the Great Chicago Fire made light work of the museum's fireproof design, when the tremendous heat of the fire melted the structural steel of the building, blowing out the formidable masonry walls, inviting in the all-consuming fire to destroy the Academy's entire collection, as well as all of the research papers of Stimson and his colleagues. Within months of this terrible event, Charles Kennicott was to pass away in late March of 1872 in downstate Illinois, at the age of 39. William Stimson died just a few months following, in late May, in Maryland, of consumption or pulmonary tuberculosis, at the age of 42. Academy President John Wells Foster was to die at his home in Hyde Park a year later in June of 1873, at the age of 58.
Decades passed with only the occasional reference to the Kennicott Mounds and their human remains in newspapers, books, and periodicals. By the mid-1890s and early 1900s, as the burgeoning and broad-shouldered Chicago took its place as one of the major cities in the U.S. and the world, local amateur archaeologists and historians attempted to capture Chicago's origins and prehistory, presenting it via local newspapers to a growing Chicago population hungry for easily digestible history lessons. Local newspapers, which were numerous, were the YouTube of their day.
One of these newspaper articles was written by 32-year-old physician Ernest H. Smith of Austin, then a near west suburb of Chicago, appearing in the July 25, 1895 edition of the Inter-Ocean newspaper. Smith's detailed account provides the first actual diagram or drawing of the site, as of mid-1895, as well as additional notes and observations. By now, the property had passed into the hands of farmer Ferdinand Trapp, a 56-year-old Prussian immigrant who lived on the farm with his wife and 4 children, in a house not too far away from the present-day pavilion at the Evansfield Cook County Forest Preserve.
Smith reported that the site possessed 9 mounds in all, varying in height from 2 to 4 feet, most being circular in form. One of the earthworks, the westmost mound, elliptical in shape, with its broad side to the river, which he associated with Mound 1 of the Stimson-Kennicott Mounds, was almost completely obliterated by this time, both by excavations and the building of the north-south road, now Thatcher Avenue. There was enough remaining for him to put its original size as being 60 feet long by 30 feet wide. A second large elliptical mound was placed to the east of the first, with similar alignment and comparable size. The remaining 7 mounds were somewhat circular or slightly elliptical in form, ranging in size from 20 to 40 feet in the long dimension to 15 to 40 feet in the short dimension, all with their broadside aligned with the river.
Smith, too, makes note of shallow trenches surrounding several of the mounds and places the mounds to the east of the first mound within a grove of oak trees. He observed that 2 of the mounds appeared to have been thoroughly excavated, likely by Stimson, Kennicott, and Durham, while most of the others had been pockmarked with holes from pot hunters and treasure seekers. He also knew of human remains recently removed from one of the mounds by an acquaintance, which he had personally examined. In the immediate area of the mound site, especially closer to the Des Plaines River, and along the creek bed that flows from the northeast, Smith described that numerous artifacts had been retrieved by him and other collectors. He noted that he had found on the order of 500 artifacts from the general area of the site, consisting of projectile points, knives, drills, scrapers, pottery sherds, and ground stone axes.
A few months later, in the September 8, 1895 edition of the Inter-Ocean, amateur historian and artist Carl Dilg, a 51-year-old emigrant from Germany, commented upon the Kennicott Mounds site, adding a noteworthy detail about the location, conveyed to him by the property owner Ferdinand Trapp. Trapp apparently had informed Dilg that the farm property included a forest of wild plum trees just to the north of the mound site, and Dilg suggested that this was one of the primary reasons which drew indigenous people into the area. A few years later, in an American Archaeologist periodical article, Dilg referred to there being 12 mounds in the Kennicott Mound group.
The next references that we have regarding the Kennicott location come from amateur archaeologist Albert F. Scharf, a friend and contemporary of Carl Dilg, born in 1857 in Gehofen, Germany. From 1898 onwards, Scharf spent much of his spare time bicycling and walking the roads and byways of the Chicago region, interviewing locals and searching for evidence of human prehistory. Originating as an oil painting, Scharf's somewhat famous map of the Chicago area, showing Native American trails, as well as the location of their villages, burial mounds, signal stations, and shipping stations, was an early attempt at recreating the prehistory of the Chicago region. Scharf was not a trained cartographer, and so his maps are not known for their precision or accuracy, and his interpretation of sites, such as signal stations, would be considered to be erroneous today by archaeologists. However, his maps and field notes were at least roughly right in identifying habitation sites of indigenous people and the trails and waterways that link them together, and he captured much of this information before it disappeared from local memory.
In his notes, Scharf made a series of observations regarding the Kennicott Mounds, most of them undated, but likely in the 1905 to 1915 timeframe. By this time, Scharf, who had visited the mound site on multiple occasions, stated that there were 5 mounds visible, set within an oak forest on the east bank of the Des Plaines River, with river banks rising 18 feet above the water. Scharf stated that none of the 5 mounds was then more than 3 feet high, and that all of the mounds had been excavated to some degree. He also observed that the stone tools found near the site were made of a bluish-white chert, believed to be from quarries to the south and west, possibly Oneota chert. He also noted that while visiting the site in 1907, he spoke to an Edwin Skillen of Oak Park, who informed Scharf that 20 years prior, he had excavated a skull from one of the mounds. This may in fact have been the same person to which Ernest Smith had alluded to previously in 1895.
From at least 1909 to the early 1910s, Scharf was leading tours of the Kennicott Mounds, as well as other prehistoric sites along the Des Plaines River. Scharf suggested that the 5 earthworks were in the form of a quincunx, like the number 5 on the head of a die, with a large central mound surrounded by 4 smaller mounds. He even went so far as to suggest that the central mound, the original Bear Mound, denoted by Benjamin Durham in his 1869 description, was actually in the shape of a buffalo, perhaps a bit of a stretch. Scharf advocated for the restoration and preservation of the Kennicott Mounds, writing that, because of being the only Indian mounds existing near the city of Chicago, they are certain to prove of future interest and education value to its citizens. The Chicago Historical Society, which organized the Scharf tours, also advocated that the Kennicott Mounds be included in the Outer Belt Park System, an early proposed form of the Cook County Forest Preserves, so as to preserve them.
The final 2 references that we have found related to the Kennicott Mounds are from newspapers, including one from August 1919 of the Chicago Tribune, which cites there were 3 mounds extant, one in the shape of a bear, although this article is something of a high-level tour of the area. The final reference is from a November 19, 1926 article from the Forest Park Review, which describes a trail along the river with the Kennicott Mounds nearby, as well as the site of a former Native American village. No other details are provided for the mound site. But regardless of the details as to their overall form, their number, their size, each of these references, from Ernest Smith's detailed 1895 description to the summary description of 1926, are important, as they tell us that at least some portion of the mound survived until at least the mid to late 1920s.
For whatever reasons, the Kennicott Mound site never became part of the Cook County Forest Preserves. It came very close, running alongside them to the west of Thatcher Road, taking in the Des Plaines River and the adjacent natural areas. The property associated with the mounds, however, such as they were by the early 1930s, were parceled up and sold as lots for new residential housing. 1938 aerial photos suggest that a few earthworks were still in existence at the site, even as a few new houses had been built within fairly close proximity of the mound's location, By 1961, aerial photos indicate that the residential boom pushing westward from Chicago had by then filled in most of the open spaces remaining near the Kennicott site, building to the doorstep, if not directly into, the precinct of the former mounds. There yet remains a small patch of open ground to this day, perhaps a quarter of an acre in size and triangular in shape, and quite possibly respecting the original mound site. There are potentially a few earthwork features yet remaining, although these could simply be tree root mounds.
As for the artifacts retrieved from the Kennicott Mounds location, most of our knowledge of such items from the area comes from Ernest Smith. In his 1895 newspaper article, he provided a set of crude drawings of the lithic artifacts, such as spear points, arrowheads, drills, scrapers, and axes, mostly just their outlines. Some of the artifacts can be at least tentatively identified based upon their general shape. For example, the small triangular points are either Madison points or triangular points, arrowheads from the Mississippian period. The larger points, which were spear or dart points, or possibly knives, appeared to be mostly archaic in date, with perhaps a few woodland types. There may be one or more Paleo-period spear points in this assemblage as well. The variety of types within this collection, as well as the relative abundance of lithics, suggested indigenous people used this location, at the very least for hunting encampments, from as early as the Paleo through the Archaic, Woodland, and Mississippian periods, from perhaps 8,000 BCE to 1,000 CE or later.
However, Smith also states that he had collected pottery sherds at the site, both plain and ornamented, although he does not describe the ornamentation, which would have been useful for dating purposes. As it is, the presence of the pottery sherds suggests at least seasonal encampments, most likely in the Woodland to Mississippian time periods.
The descriptions of the Kennicott earthworks, as well as the human remains associated with at least some of them, is also instructive. For example, inhumation burials, including flex burials, fall in line with Woodland period mortuary practices. As only portions of some human skeletons were found, it is also possible that bundle burials were included in one or more of the Kennicott mounds, which would suggest late Woodland dating. The shapes and sizes of the mounds may also provide clues as to dating. The original discoverers of the mounds, Stimson, Kennicott, and Durham, indicated that at least one of the larger mounds was in the shape of an animal, possibly a bear, although the shape was not readily apparent to observers a few decades later. But this, along with the fact that most of the described mounds were relatively low, 2 to 3 feet in height, and conical in shape, hints that the earthworks may have been a mix of burial mounds and effigy mounds from the Woodland and late Woodland time periods.
The Kennicott Mound site location would have held many attractions for indigenous people. The river afforded fishing, the hunting of game and fowl, as well as travel via canoe for trade, all along the Des Plaines River, as well as the Illinois River Basin. The forests surrounding this site, documented by the earliest surveyors, as well as by the early investigators, would have been home to game such as deer. Fruits and berries, such as wild plums, may have grown in abundance here, and would have been harvested seasonally. The open prairie beyond the forest would have provided additional hunting opportunities for buffalo and antelope. Marshlands just to the west of the mound site, nestled within the river's contorted meander, would have provided medicinal herbs and foodstuffs, as well as attracting wildfowl for hunting. As we've seen with other indigenous sites in the Chicago region, the Kennicott Mound location provided a variety of what anthropologists refer to as ecotones, the transition zones between differing ecosystems where food and resources are more plentiful, and which indigenous people would have fully exploited.
As the Kennicott Mounds site has been almost completely destroyed by early investigations, casual plundering, road building, and residential construction, what can be said about the location, based at least upon the initial descriptive evidence? Putting it all together, we can say with some assurance that indigenous people were exploiting this landscape for several thousand years or more in order to raise their families and live out their lives, sometimes sojourning for a few days in hunting encampments, other times staying for weeks or an entire season while they harvested local resources. It was these seasonal encampments which likely gave the location a greater sense of permanence for the indigenous inhabitants, a place of memory passed down from generation to generation, sufficiently so that they created a sacred space along the riverbank in the form of community-built earthworks to honor and bury the dead of their clan members some 1,000 to 2,000 years ago during the Woodland period, or later to serve as a focal point for family rituals in the late Woodland and Mississippian periods, 800 to 1,200 years ago.
These earthworks were sustained for several hundred years or more before the European colonization of North America. Only in the past 100 years have these earthen monuments been destroyed. For us today, the Kennicott Mounds are a reminder of how much we have lost, how fragile is our national heritage, and how we must preserve and protect such sites in the future.
Many, many thanks to our regular viewers, our subscribers, and to our Patreon supporters. As always, if you enjoy these videos, please remember to like, subscribe, comment, and share. And if you're so inclined, consider supporting our channel via Patreon. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you, in a manner of speaking, in our next video adventure.